Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Amory Sivertson. I'm the co-host of one of our WBUR podcasts called Endless Thread.
And I'm Angus Chen, Common Health Reporter for WBUR.
And this is our final event in the WBUR CitySpace Town Hall series on the science, rollout, safety of the COVID-19 vaccine. And we are streaming live tonight from the WBUR CitySpace Facebook and YouTube channels. And if you haven't already, we encourage you to like us on those channels and subscribe so that we can notify you whenever we go live with an event like this.
If you've joined us for the other events in this series, you know we've covered a lot of ground. In our first event, we dug into the science behind the COVID vaccines. The second event focused on the difficulties of mass vaccination campaigns. And last week, we discussed the ethical concerns around vaccination, especially as they relate to equity.
So tonight is all about the big misconceptions around the vaccine. What's being said about it, how we discern fact from fiction, which is obviously critically important dealing with the pandemic, especially in the digital age when it's hard to tell truth from fiction. So tonight's all about your questions, and we want to know what's still unclear to you. Maybe you know people who are having doubts about the vaccine and you want to help share good information with them. Maybe you yourself have questions about the vaccine and you've come here for a safe space, no stupid questions. This is why we're here, to get to the bottom of all of this. So you can go to slido.com. It's SLIDO.com. And you want to enter the event code vaccines. And that's where you put your questions in. We're going to get to as many of them as we can.
So Amory and I obviously were not health experts, so we've invited two card-carrying medical doctors to help us navigate all of this. Dr. Charles Anderson is the president and CEO of the Dimock Center, and Dr. Sabrina Assoumou, Boston University School of Medicine assistant professor and infectious disease physician at Boston Medical Center. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Okay, so to get us kicked off, Dr. Anderson, let's start with you. I was hoping you can tell us a little bit about your role at the Dimock Center, and are you doing things now in the pandemic that you didn't expect to be doing?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity, and look forward to sharing. We're definitely doing a lot more than we thought we'd be doing. Here at the Dimock Center, we're actually right in the middle of Roxbury, 9-acre campus. We serve about 19,000 people. And so, as you can imagine, it's been quite an effort to try to get at least our patients vaccinated. So we've taken one of the buildings on our campus, we've created a vaccination site, we've created a team of street team members, as I call them, who are going out and spreading the word and helping people become more confident in this vaccine. I really have my team focused on this, probably 95% of their effort, and at the same time trying to do all the other services that we provide.
What about you, Dr. Assoumou? I guess you maybe didn't expect to be working in the pandemic when you started as an infectious disease physician or a medical professor.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having us here tonight. So as you said, I am an infectious disease physician. My area of focus is HIV. So in terms of dealing with epidemics, I guess that's why I joined medicine in the beginning. It's been a pretty challenging year, but today was actually, I was listening to Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins today and talking about the light at the end of the tunnel. So it is definitely a new day, given that we have the vaccine. But in the spring, it was really hard for us at BMC. One day we had no patients, and then all of a sudden it was a terrible surge. So my role was, first of all, taking care of patients at the hospital, but also developing protocols for the hospital, because at the time we didn't have any FDA-approved treatments, and we relied on pretty much bread and butter, like taking care, supportive care of patients. And my role now has been, I think actually I was on WBUR, actually. I think it was WBUR, one of the NPR stations, and the reporter actually called me a vaccine evangelist. And I've actually taken that label with pride, because all I do all day is talk about vaccines. how wonderful they are and how they can allow us to get to the new normal. I talk to my patients, I talk to my family. I was actually very lucky to be included in the Massachusetts Department of Public Health campaign for vaccines, so vaccination. So I didn't expect to actually be in the video that's promoted about the Department of Public Health sharing the good news about vaccine, but I'm very happy that I've been able to play that role.
Vaccine evangelist. I like it. So that segues to something that's been on my mind, which is one of the reasons why I specifically am here is because on the podcast that I make, Endless Thread, 2 years ago, when measles was the disease that we were talking about all the time, we did this 5-part series called Infectious, where we looked at the history of vaccines and looked at the anti-vaccination movement. And we so often think of, you're either pro-vaccine, you're either a vaccine evangelist, maybe not with your credentials, but you're either pro-vaccine or you're anti-vaccine. And that a lot of people were frustrated that there didn't seem to be room for a middle ground. There didn't seem to be a safe space to ask questions, legitimate questions about any of these vaccines. And I wonder how each of you thinks about people that have been labeled, maybe the middle ground term is vaccine hesitant or vaccine skeptical. Are those terms that you both use, or how do you think about the people who feel a little conflicted in between, have questions?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I actually, I think I've been sharing this a lot. So I don't particularly like the term vaccine hesitancy. And someone, Dr. Corby Smith from UNC on a podcast talked about reframing it and calling it vaccine deliberations. And I actually fell in love with that term, and I prefer to actually use it because from my own experience, even with talking to my family about it or my patients, there's been so much misinformation. And a lot of the times people just want the information so that they can think about it, come back with additional questions, deliberate. So I thought that was really a fabulous term and a wonderful way to sort of think about that. And I think that, a lot of the times, and I've done a lot of, radio, TV, just talking to my patients, all of the questions that I've gotten actually make a lot of sense. People are worried about, why was it this fast? Am I going to have any side effects? So a lot of the questions make a lot of sense. There's also this conspiracy theories, but even that, they make sense in this because there was just been so much misinformation. And if I hadn't been able to read the scientific journals and know the data, I would also be worried because of the vacuum. So I think that it is really important to think of the process as sort of, it's an iterative process. We just have to provide additional information. But one thing that's been really encouraging, and I work at a safety net hospital, and I can tell you that although I haven't been able to convince all of my patients, but the majority of patients, once you provide information, most people want to get vaccinated and they actually want access. At this point, I have a lot of patients who want to get vaccinated and haven't been able to yet.
Dr. Anderson, what about you? What's been your experience with this?
Well, it's been fascinating because first of all, I also have my own term for this, and I call it vaccine confidence. We're trying to build confidence in the vaccine from where I sit. But what's been really fascinating is, so I'm also a pediatrician, newborn intensive care, pediatrics. So I lived through many of these phases of anti-vaccine, whatever we might want to call it. And one of the things that we learned from that is just hammering people with information didn't really work. As a matter of fact, what we found, if anything, after a while, they just got fatigued. It was almost as if you were trying to convince them of something and they weren't really there. And what we found is that there was often something underlying it. And what's really interesting about where we are now in terms of building vaccine confidence, when you really take the time to hear people's stories, especially in the community that I serve, where we're talking largely Black and Latinx community, what you start to hear is these stories about not only the things we think in terms of Henrietta Lacks or in terms of the syphilis experiment. What we hear about is just the day-to-day challenges with racial discrimination, quite honestly, which contributes to this real huge sense of distrust. And that's why I like thinking about this in terms of how do we build confidence. And what we found is that allowing people to tell their stories is incredibly powerful. And it reminded me of those days in the pediatrics days where it was really individuals talking about how they became more confident. And they were talking to each other in their own language, with their own shared experience. And we're finding real great success right now with that in our street team.
Yeah, I think that brings us to another question that Amory and I wanted to ask, which is when you encounter someone who is deliberating about a vaccine, how do you talk to them? I mean, and is it, I guess specifically, for people who are listening to this town hall, if it's a friend or a family, is there a way that you would engage with somebody who's thinking about getting a vaccine and maybe isn't quite sure if they want to get the coronavirus vaccine?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And actually, my experience has taught me that like every encounter or every experience is actually an opportunity to talk about vaccine. And actually, one of the fellows at the hospital mentioned that one day she went to the grocery store and was wearing her Boston Medical Center infectious disease t-shirt, and actually at the cashier asked her, what do you think about these vaccines? And this was our opportunity to talk about vaccines. So for me, it's been like with every encounter with a patient, we're talking about other things, trying to save a few minutes at the end to talk about vaccines. And I usually, actually a friend of mine came up with it, but I like acronyms. And so I think of the AAA, ask, acknowledge, and an answer. And the first one is like just asking people with the casual open-ended questions, like, what are your thoughts about vaccines? And letting people talk and share, not with any assumptions. Because what I've realized is everyone has a slightly different angle that they're coming from and has, very different concerns. So the first thing is open-ended questions. What are your thoughts about vaccines and what are you thinking about them? The second one for me, especially because I work at a safety net hospital with a very diverse patient population, is to acknowledge, first of all, the misinformation that has happened and also the history of, patients. We often talk about, Tuskegee experiment, but the personal history and the lived experience of what it is like to be a person of color in the US. A lot of patients would tell you about many encounters where this is not talking about what happened in the past, but what happened to them today, what happened to their family or their friends. Even thinking about COVID-19, Dr. Susan Moore was a physician. I don't know if you guys have heard about it. She was a family physician who died of COVID-19. And this is very powerful for me also, especially because she was a doctor. She had all the knowledge, but unfortunately, from when she described her experience, that did not shield her from not getting the care that she thought she required. So acknowledging the personal experience and the lived experience, and then answering all the questions and also coming back and answering those other questions, but also sharing exactly what Dr. Anderson said, the personal stories. And for me, one of my greatest joys, actually, what happened recently in a just casual encounter with one of my patients. And, I was launching in and asking him about, are you interested in getting the vaccines? And he was actually, oh, I've been vaccinated, because he was, because of his occupation. And he said, I saw you on TV. And you said that you got vaccinated and the vaccine was safe. So I didn't even need to talk to you or call you. He's like, I was going to call you, but I saw you. You said it was safe. So I got vaccinated. So just the importance of sharing your personal stories and your reason for doing it. And for me, I always say I got vaccinated for me to protect myself, to protect my family, to protect my community, and just realizing that was actually very powerful for him.
So we have a lot of attendees who have questions, and some people submitted their questions long before the event even began. They couldn't wait to hear from both of you. So I'm going to turn to one of those now, and it has to do with these new CDC guidelines. So up before yesterday, we were hearing that long after people were vaccinated, we might still need to be wearing masks, maybe through 2021. Now, as of yesterday, that might not be the case anymore. There is more light at the end of the tunnel talk happening. So there's some confusion over this, though. With the new CDC guidelines, someone asks, does everyone in a room have to be fully vaccinated in order to safely remove masks and not social distance? So I'd love first to hear both of your takes on the new CDC guidelines, and are we Are we too optimistic too quickly, or does this feel right? Tell me more.
I'd be cautious about being too optimistic too quickly. I really would. I've heard the guidelines as well, and it's interesting. I had similar conversation with a friend. It's can we get, if 5 people in the room, but one person isn't, does that person just be the only one who has a mask on? And I think the concern here, quite honestly, is that we're all getting tired. We all want to get back to our normal lives. And I'm always concerned with things like this when we know there's light at the end of the tunnel, and that's really important. But I'd be really cautious in terms of over-interpreting. The way I interpret it, and again, I'm probably being incredibly conservative in this approach, is that when I'm around individuals who actually have been vaccinated, and I think about that in terms of the 1 or 2 or 3 people I might have at my home who've been vaccinated, that we now can feel comfortable since we've all been vaccinated and understand the science behind it, which we might get into some. It allows me to feel much more comfortable, plus with that guideline that the 4 of us can be there without a mask on, right? When you start talking about introducing those who have not been vaccinated, it still makes sense for me for all of us to have a mask on. Because even though I've been vaccinated, the reality is I can still be exposed to the virus. And even though my viral load is going to be very low, if anything, is there still the slight potential that between the 4 of us, we might infect someone who's not been vaccinated? I feel really awful about that. And I don't think we have enough data to help us know for sure. So that's just my interpretation of it, but I'd be very curious to hear what our infectious disease specialist says about this.
Yeah, no, I actually was I thought it was actually a good move from the CDC to use the latest data that we have to start making people feel like we are making progress and there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I think that was a very powerful message. The problem with public health messages is that there's a lot of nuance, right? And it's really hard to get it right because some people often don't listen till the end. They just hear what they want to hear and they're done. The important message from the CDC recommendations was, number one, recommendation for persons who are getting vaccinated. It's just that, if you're vaccinated and you've had the 2 weeks after being vaccinated and you're within the 3 months, there are little details that you have to think about, but you don't have to quarantine if you're exposed and you're asymptomatic and you don't have any symptoms. So that's actually important because before that, if you're exposed, you have to still go through like the whole testing and quarantine. So for me as a healthcare worker who's more likely to get exposed, that actually is good news. Then the second message is in terms of what does that mean for people who are vaccinated, and what is it that you can or can't do? I think that it was a very powerful message for grandparents who are local to say, you're vaccinated and you can visit your grandchildren, and even though they have not been vaccinated yet because we don't have a vaccine, but if they're low risk and they're healthy, you can in your house get together with them, take off that mask and hug them. I think that was a very important message that we needed to hear. And I think when I was listening to Dr. Walensky yesterday too, she tried to do the nuance thing, which is, but if you're around people who have not been vaccinated, it's important to know that we're still going to have to follow those public health measures. And I like that there was actually an alternative, which said, go outside. Outside is better than inside. Wear a mask. Still be safe, but you can still do things safely. So I like that. I think it was a good message. But I also worry about people not listening to the full. There's still like if you're around people who are at high risk, the recommendation is not that you can take off your mask and everything, because there's still risk associated with that. So.
I think along this lines, the part of the CDC press release this week said that there's some growing evidence suggesting that if you've been fully vaccinated, you're much less likely to transmit the virus to other people, which is, I think, something that we health experts have been worrying about for a while. And I guess I wanted to ask you guys, are you familiar with this growing evidence? Is it something that, that you can talk about, sort of say like, or point to what it is exactly?
Yeah, I can also say I've not seen the studies, but it makes good sense logically, right? I mean, you think about what's actually happening. Even if you're exposed to the virus, we know that regardless of which one of these vaccines that you have, and if you're out past that period of time where you can say now you're fully immunized, we do know that what this means is that your body is going to be able to appropriately deal with that virus so that your viral load is low enough that the odds of you transmitting it to someone else are slim to none, right? That said, I've not seen the data, and I'm not sure if we have data there yet.
Yeah, no, it's funny. There are a few questions that we always think about. It's like, how long am I going to be protected? That's another big one. How long, can I still transmit if I'm vaccinated? And a lot of people may feel like, oh, then what was the point of getting vaccinated if I can't get back to normal life? So there are actually emerging data from Israel, where Israel has been on the forefront because they've been really aggressive about vaccinating the whole population. And one of the things that they actually done is they actually collected really, really valuable data for us in the real world. So we have data from the clinical trials, but the real world, they were actually swabbing people. And what they saw was that when you compared people who were vaccinated to people who were not vaccinated, the people who were vaccinated had like a 90% decrease in having COVID-19 that was asymptomatic. So that means that because that was what we were really worried about, that you would have COVID-19 but no symptoms and then transmit to somebody. So what they showed was that people who were vaccinated were less likely to have COVID-19 infection that was asymptomatic. So these are suggestive that, the vaccines are probably going to protect us from transmitting. It's not 100%, but it's actually pretty good data in terms of reassuring us. The other thing is that we're just going to need to wait to get more data, but these are very suggestive because if you talk to a group of infectious disease specialists, it's really hard to think of an infection that's going to prevent you from getting severe disease and dying, but not protect you from just transmitting. So it's very it's really hard. So that's why we were very hopeful that that would be the case. But until we get the data, it's really hard to come up with public health recommendation, which is why I understand that the CDC is being cautious.
So we have 3 vaccines in the mix now. We've heard a lot about Moderna and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines, and now the latest, Johnson & Johnson. It's a different kind of vaccine, and you only get 1 dose, and there's a different efficacy rate. Does one of you want to explain, this is an audience question, take on the why there is a difference in efficacy between Johnson & Johnson and the 2 mRNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about that is when we talk about efficacy, part of it is what does that mean, right? So when you think about this study, you take one group of people and you give them, they end up getting the placebo, so they don't get the real vaccine. Another group gets the vaccine. And then they look after a certain amount of time and they ask the question, how many of them in each group actually had symptomatic COVID? And it have to be symptomatic because that's how they're raising their hand and say they have COVID. And so we talk about this efficacy, it's really more about how good is this vaccine at preventing one from getting COVID, right? So that's how these were really done. Now, the thing when you really think about this is that first, they did this work looking at influenza, and influenza was 50%. Yeah, I think it was actually more between 40 and 60, right? And so when we start talking about efficacy rates, the FDA said, look, as long as it's 50% or better, we're going to actually approve it for emergency use. So you've got Johnson & Johnson, which in the US, I believe it's 72%. effective. And actually, there's another number they quote very often, 85%, which tells you how effective it was from preventing severe disease, which is probably even most important for us. But either way, it's way above that threshold of 50%. If we didn't have Moderna or Pfizer at 90+%, we'd be all really, really excited about Johnson & Johnson, and we should be, because these are all 3 vaccines that have proven to be very effective in terms of preventing symptomatic disease and doing it in a way that's better than the threshold that we'd set of 50%. So, they are different in terms of that, different mechanisms in terms of how they work. But I tell people all the time, whichever one you can get, as soon as you can get it, when your number comes up, by all means, get it.
Yeah, I often get the question is, Doc, which vaccine should I get? And I usually say my answer is always the best vaccines for you is the vaccine that's available the day that that is your turn. So that's really the message, because the important thing, so it's funny because when the press release came out, you had J&J 66% effective, and then we all remember that 95%. That was pretty astounding. And so that was kind of the headline for a while. And we in the infectious disease community were like, the message is not getting out because of how excited we are, number one, that we have 3 vaccines. But like the nuance was not being conveyed because these studies were done at different times. When we didn't have the variants, it was different countries. So we weren't really comparing, apples to apples. It was more apples to oranges. And when I tell my patients, it's, me as a doctor and an infectious disease specialist, what I really care about is I don't want you to come to my hospital with COVID. I don't want you to have to get intubated with COVID. I don't want you to die from COVID. And all these 3 vaccines do it just as well. And if you look at the data, they're all 100% effective at protecting what I really care about. So that's why we say that these vaccines are just as good in terms of getting all of us to the new normal.
I want to ask another audience question. This has to do with some of the misinformation about vaccines that are out there. The question is, my entire family is refusing to get vaccinated because of the microchip conspiracy theory. This is, if you're not familiar, this is the idea that the vaccines are embedded with a microchip that will tag you somehow or some way. Actually, I'm not really sure what they think this microchip is supposed to do, but what can I do to convince them otherwise?
Yeah, we hear this one as well. And part of the concern about the microchip is about being tracked. Even if you could come up with some way to attach a microchip to something that's going to be injected as part of a vaccine, even if you could do that, right, and make sure it's powered and all the rest of that, which in itself sounds somewhat sci-fi. I always tell those, especially there's a couple of young people I had a conversation with about this, if you're really concerned about being tracked, you really need to be worried about your cell phone. Someone really, really wants to track you. They have easier ways to do that than to put microchips in a vaccine. But the reality is, for a lot of people, they really are concerned and have a real belief about that, which I think gets to this whole element of just lack of trust. And that's one of the real things that we're battling there. But the way I talk to the folks about it is really more so making the comparison that if someone really wanted to track you, they could use your cell phone. And it's a lot of effort to go through.
Yeah, like they wouldn't spend billions of dollars trying to track you. They already are in your pocket. But one thing that was really interesting to me, actually, I was listening to the interview between Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci actually today on NPR. And one of the things that they were talking about, 1 year down the line, is specifically about this conspiracy theories of the microchip. They were like, we wouldn't even have envisioned that this would be like a concern, because it just, wouldn't, like, they were not like scientifically like advanced enough to come up with like a mechanism to be able to do that. So I think that what we're hoping, though, is that when more people see that more people are getting vaccinated and people are actually doing fine, and also realizing that, we all have a role to play to get all of us back to the new normal, because that's one thing that COVID-19 taught us, is that we are all connected and that none of us is safe until all of us are safe. And so realizing that we all have a role to play in this, I'm hoping that that would sort of change some of the perspectives about the vaccine.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And also, it is an interesting point that we don't need to worry about a vaccine tracking us, as we are all being tracked already all the time. There's another bit of misinformation out there that seems to not really go away. And this is one that I've heard has come up sort of, I guess, a few months ago. It's sort of been floating around that the vaccines, especially the mRNA vaccines, can have an effect, a sort of a negative effect on fertility. Do you guys know where this idea came from, and how would somebody ask, or how would somebody talk to a friend of theirs or a family member of theirs who is convinced that this might be a problem?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question, and I can tell you that even amongst people who know the data and who've thought about it, even healthcare workers, it is a concern. And usually the thing that conspiracy theories do is they usually tap into something that people really care about, and kind of, because if you don't know very much, no one wants to have their fertility impacted. And so it taps into something that's really a concern, and given the lack of the vacuum of information, it seems to persist. So what usually I do is I talk to people about a little bit about, for the mRNA vaccine, what they actually do and what they don't do. So the very important message is, first of all, the mRNA, the reason why we've all heard in the news that when you transport the vaccines, you have to keep it in these really cold, ultra cold temperatures. And the reason why is because this mRNA is very fragile. It's not something that sticks around for a while. And so one thing to communicate is that, as soon as you get that mRNA vaccine, within hours, like it sort of disintegrates and goes away. So it's not something that's gonna stay in your body and either change your DNA or do anything like that. It just doesn't do that. And an important thing to convey is that it's not gonna go into the nucleus. It's not gonna change your DNA. So kind of getting all those things out there really early on to make sure that that's not a concern. So usually the way that I sort of address it is sort of saying, this is something that's fleeting, it's going to go away, it's not something that's going to permanently change you. I also acknowledge that, these vaccines are new, and it is true that we don't have decades of information to be able to sort of to reassure people. But what we do have is, we do know that most vaccines, like all the vaccines that we have, usually that we have around, usually if you're going to have a serious side effects, you usually get it within several weeks. And so within that's why the FDA picked the 2-month cutoff to be able to start evaluating for the emergency use authorization, is because most of the side effects that you're going to have are going to develop within the first 2 months. And so that's why they had that cutoff. So what I can say is, we've had thousands of people who've gone through these studies, and, the FDA has looked at it. We're still keeping track, with the CDC now, with millions of people who have been vaccinated. And we have not found anything to suggest that, that it should have a negative consequence and implication related to fertility.
Yeah, I guess and I think it's a good point that these mRNA vaccines especially are pretty short-lived, or the mRNA is pretty short-lived in your body. I guess the only the only permanent change I'd be hoping for is immunity to COVID forever.
Keep dreaming, Angus. Keep the faith.
Right.
Well, Dr. Assoumou, you just said something that jumped out at me because there's a question that I have heard a lot, and it has to do with how quickly these vaccines were made. And you said, we don't have the decades of data that we do with other vaccines. So what do you say to people who question, this is really for both of you, what do you say to people who question, how quickly this was done. These vaccines they went through clinical trials. They only have this emergency use, sign off so far. They don't have official FDA approval. So how do you assure people that this is okay?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up very often, as you can imagine, just like you're hearing. And the reality is, I try to help people understand, and our team really does a great job at this, trying to help people understand that a couple things happen. One, we really needed to get this done quickly. Yes, it's unfortunate we called it warp speed and all the rest of that, but the reality is people were dying. We needed to get this done quickly. And so because of that, a lot of money was thrown at it. And then once you throw money at something, it's amazing how quickly a process can go. Because typically what would happen is if I'm making an investment in developing this, I want to wait till I get results from this before I make further investments, right? So I think part of it, there was a huge investment in getting this done. Number two, this technology, this mRNA technology, really is an incredible scientific breakthrough, which goes back a decade, right? It's not new, but the reality, it allowed us to be able to do this much more quickly. And I think that's really important for people to understand. It's just this breakthrough in science, and we have these breakthroughs that actually allow us to move more quickly. And the other one is there were no safety steps skipped, but there were things that were being done in parallel that otherwise would have been done in series. And I think that's a big, big thing for people to understand. And I think, once people really get their head around that, and then quite honestly, I often remind people that there's already, 30 million people who've taken this in the US. There's lines of people waiting to get this vaccine. The reality is we've got lots of data across the world now in terms of watching people's response to this. So, these things are happening all in parallel, getting us to that place where we know, A, we haven't skipped any important steps, and B, we've been able to harness this amazing technology to be able to do this more quickly. And I think this is going to be the future of how vaccines are going to be done, quite frankly.
Speaking of these vaccines, there's an audience question that came in that I personally wondered a bit about myself. If you've gotten one of the mRNA vaccines, let's say the Moderna, but you can't make your second appointment that they made for you for some reason, can you go and get a Pfizer vaccine to make up for your second dose? Or, because it's this also an mRNA vaccine, or can you even sort of fill it in with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine later on?
So that's an interesting question. And the good thing is CDC actually thought about that question. They actually have a guidance on that. So first of all, the message is, number one, we really want people to get like the same vaccine that they've received before. Like if you got a Moderna, we try really encourage. And that's why when we schedule the first appointment, we try to always make sure that that's the way we did at my hospital. And I think a lot of places are doing that too, is when you get your shot, you get your second appointment, to sort of make sure that you're in the books and you're good and you're set to go. So number one, so try to get the same one. But, CDC says like if under, extreme circumstances, you can't find, you got a Moderna and then you can't find, another Moderna for whatever reason, and it's been really hard and you've tried other things, you can get a Pfizer. Like you can, for the mRNA vaccine, because the guidance came out before J&J. And you just have to think, J&J is a different technology. It's a viral vector and versus, an mRNA technology. So for that one, we don't really, and they don't have a guidance, but, under extreme circumstances, in terms of the mRNA vaccines, they say that you could potentially get another one, but try to get the same one if possible.
We've had another audience question come in that piqued my interest. They said, I've already had COVID. So to that listener, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you're feeling better. They ask, aren't my own antibodies better than getting a vaccine? So this plays a little bit into, I'm curious about this. I'm curious about, you mentioned, do we know how long you're protected for with both of these vaccines? So a little bit of everything in here. What do you think, Dr. Assoumou?
Yeah, no, I actually love that question because it allows me to talk a little bit about the science of like how these vaccines work. And so, so the first message is that even if you've had COVID, we do want you to get vaccinated. And the reason why is because, people have COVID and you can have different, you can have a mild form, you can have a more severe form. We know for sure that people who have had more severe COVID are more likely to have higher levels of antibodies that would protect them. So someone, you may have had like asymptomatic disease or mild symptoms, and that means that your antibodies may not have been as high as we would want them to be for you to be protected. But the reason why we actually want you to get vaccinated is because one of the exciting discoveries with the mRNA vaccine is that, you get 2 shots. The first shot is a priming shot. So it primes your immune system. It kind of wakes it up and say, okay, we have something here. We're trying to teach the immune system. And then the second one is a boost. And what the boost does, it really solidifies your immune response. And that's the solidification of the immune response. What it's actually doing is, with that second shot, with the boost, you get what we call memory cells. So you get like the cells that are going to live in your body for a really long time and protect you for quite a long time afterwards. And for the mRNA vaccines, we know that you get that after the second shot. And so what I worry about is, you may get mild form of COVID-19, but you may not have developed those longer lasting memory cells that are going to protect you for quite a while. And so that's why it's really important that even if one has had COVID-19, to still get vaccinated, to make sure that you get to that level where you're going to be protected for a longer period of time.
I want to ask this other audience question, which has to do with communities of color. We know that communities of color have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, but they're also less likely to be vaccinated or less likely to have access to the vaccine. What can we do, and how can we be advocates for ourselves and in our communities?
Well, we're dealing with that every day here on our campus. And, a big part of that is taking that 40 to 50% of people who are actually saying, this is something that I'm interested in, and allowing them to act as a big part of the message and the messenger. And I really frame it that way because the message also becomes their story, but they're also trusted messengers in their community, just as we are. We've been on our campus for over 100 years, and we've built trusting relationships in the community, which are incredibly important in terms of allowing people to get to that point where they can say, I'm being heard, my concerns are being heard, and now they're open to say, all right, let's now have the discussion about this, or deliberate. I like that. I think I'm gonna start using that actually. It allows for that type of deliberation to happen in a safe space, a safe, trusted space. And I think that's the key. So what we also have to do, and what we're finding, is we have to focus on the positive. And what you hear from people's stories are, they can't wait to get back to that point where they can hug their grandkids. They haven't seen their mom in Jackson, Mississippi for a year, or they haven't visited, and this goes on. And you can hear people tell these stories, which remind all of us of that importance of what we've missed over this last year and a few months. And people are really eager to get back to that. And I think that's really resonating as well with people. So trusted messenger, making sure that we're actually allowing space for people to communicate their stories, and then making sure we're highlighting this as this is about triumph. This is about taking control after we've been in a situation of loss of control. This is about getting us back to where we were, and hopefully even better and stronger.
Yeah, no, that's just all really great points. I actually also would like to add that bringing the vaccines to the community is so key. And by that I mean, where are the vaccine sites? Are we putting them in the places that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic? Because if you think about it, like the same thing happened with testing that we're seeing. It's funny. I always talk about the fact that no matter what the disease is, you can label it whichever way you want, but the pattern is often the same, right? You look at like who's getting vaccinated, who's dying from COVID, who's dying from who has diabetes. No matter how you label it, the graph always looks the same. And for COVID, the issue is bringing the vaccine to the communities and opening those sites. And I know it's like Boston Medical Center, we actually opened sites, in Roxbury and like Mattapan and other places to sort of bring the vaccines to the community so that, it's nice to have larger sites in other places, but like what we've seen with testing, this is what happened before, like, with testing, it was like, you could go to these drive-through and get tested, but if you don't have a car, you can't really go to a drive-through. And if you can't like drive to certain sites, it's not made accessible to you. So I think a key thing is bringing the vaccines to the community. And exactly as what Dr. Anderson said, like having trusted leaders from the community and using like, it's funny, I like to think of like there's so many lessons that we learned from the HIV epidemic that are so applicable for COVID-19, which is, using faith leaders who are trusted, who are known in the community, going to churches and testing people, going to churches and vaccinating people. Like these are all very important steps on how you actually address and try to change those trends that we've seen.
Yeah, I want to follow up with another audience question. It's sort of, it's not really related, but it has to do with another, I guess, vulnerable group that we think about. And this is, can you explain scientifically how vaccines aren't harmful to pregnant women or their fetuses? And I guess maybe Dr. Assoumou, if you could take this question again.
Yeah, no, that's another very important and very important question that comes up all the time. And one way to actually start thinking about it is to think about, before even going about the technicalities of like, what are the potential things that could happen. Number one, we know that if you're a pregnant woman and you get COVID-19, we know that you're going to do worse. And so one of the things to illustrate is that, especially, let's say you're a healthcare worker who is more likely to get exposed to COVID-19 and you're pregnant, like your risk of dying of COVID-19 is really high. And so that's why you'll see that a lot of healthcare workers who are pregnant actually get vaccinated so that they could, protect themselves, protect, their baby, but also provide additional information so that we can know like what to do. So in terms of what to do with, in terms of pregnancy, the current CDC recommendation is that all women have a conversation with their doctor to be able to have their questions answered. And our job as doctors is to, first of all, start with like, I don't have like decades of data. Unfortunately, the studies were not done with, pregnant women who included, some people got pregnant during the studies, but they were not included in the study. So that's why we don't have that information. So I acknowledge the unknowns, but also talk about the knowns and what I've talked about in terms of what happens with pregnant women and COVID and pregnancy. But what I actually say and what I talk about is I can talk about the science and what I know about the vaccines and how they work. Like the mRNA vaccine, as we've talked about before, the mRNA is not something that's stable for a long time. I don't have any reasons to think that it's gonna, it goes away pretty quickly. It's not gonna go to your nucleus. I don't have any data to support it to make me think that it's going to be harmful to the baby. There are animal studies that were reassuring. So kind of talking about what is it that we do know, acknowledging what we don't know, but also acknowledging the real negative implications or complications that could happen with being pregnant and having COVID.
So this is a question for either of you, but that specific point about pregnant women and the vaccine brings up the unknowns, as you mentioned, and that just comes with the territory of science. I think that there are a lot of unknowns, and that's part of the field. But are there other unknowns or things that you are especially eager to get the data on with regards to the virus, the new various strains of the virus that we are seeing, how the vaccines, respond to various strains, anything at all? What are the unknowns for you that you might talk candidly about with patients as a way to own up to the fact that, yeah, we don't know everything, but here's what we do know, and here's why I feel confident about what we do know? What are the unknowns?
Yeah, I think one of and it's a slightly different way to think about it. But for me, a lot of the unknowns, which we talk a lot about, are the unknowns related to the virus. What we're seeing in terms of this long haul COVID, and what does that all mean? So I think for me, there's these unknowns related to this infection that really play into why it's really important and was important to me to think about being vaccinated myself, quite frankly, because of the unknowns of what this infection can be. Again, my background in pediatrics, I've seen children with these types of autoimmune things that started to emerge related to COVID. And it really reminded me of how little we know about what the impact of this virus might be on the long term for adults as well as for children. So that's one of those areas that I find myself spending a lot of time just really thinking about. But in terms of the unknowns, in terms of the vaccine, why don't we'll let our expert there take those questions.
Yeah, no, those are great, Dr. Anderson. And I'll tell you, when I think of COVID-19, I always think of it as like it's a humbling illness. It made us realize how much we don't know. Like the big thing for me when I remember is like seeing all these clotting issues that were happening, and people, we don't see that with influenza, but with COVID, it seemed to go everywhere and like impact everyone and everything. So it could do anything. So that's one of the unknowns. Like, what are the long-term implications, from having, COVID-19? So that's actually a very important one. Another important question is, how long is immunity going to last for? Because that's going to determine, are we going to need another booster? What I'm hoping for, and from the data that we have so far, I'm cautiously optimistic that immunity is going to last at least for a few years. And so that we're not going to have to get boosted, anytime soon. Like, well, we have to do our part and deal with the variants. But so I'm hopeful that it's going to last, a few years. So that's going to be a big unknown that's going to be interesting to know, and only time will tell. But that's going to be an important one. Another thing is, oh, sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to ask, Dr. Assoumou, how will we know if the vaccine is wearing off on our population? Is it like, what do you think the signs of that will be? And do you think we'll get an early warning before like another big outbreak happens, if that is going to happen?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. But what we're hoping is, for instance, with either people who were infected early on or people who were vaccinated early on, they're still going to be followed very closely. But, if we start seeing people who were fully vaccinated and were doing fine, and then all of a sudden people start having, getting hospitalized and being very sick, those could be signs. But we're hoping that we're going to be able to find that out sooner before people get sick. But just from like continuing to do studies and monitoring people. One of the other unknowns is, the variants are like the big unknown, but I like to think of the variants as like, this is something that we all have the ability to do something about. And I'm not going to closely quote Dr. Fauci, but I didn't remember the quote exactly, but he's like, the virus can't mutate if you don't give it an opportunity to mutate. So it's kind of like, if you follow the public health measures, you wear your mask, you physically distance, you wash your hands, there are not going to be that many opportunities for the virus to mutate and create more variants. So in terms of some of the warning signs that are going to happen is, if we start seeing people who are fully vaccinated who start being hospitalized with, severe COVID, right, and dying. So those are going to be like concerning signs. But so far, from what we know from, all the different variants that we've been studying, we haven't seen that people who were fully vaccinated, being infected with like, severe infection. So I think I'm optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic that, we have 60 million people who are vaccinated today. I'm cautiously optimistic that with the weather becoming better, and that we're probably hopefully going to turn the corner.
Well, events like this give me a lot of hope, because one of the things that we kept hearing when my team on the show Endless Thread and I were reporting our infectious series a couple of years ago in the midst of the measles outbreak is we heard from a lot of parents who felt written off by their doctors, who felt like they had concerns, they had questions, and their child's pediatrician in this case, given the measles, their child's pediatrician really didn't have the time to sit down and answer every question that they had about a particular vaccine. And that's part of why we're doing this event is we have the two of you who can help us take on all of these questions. But, Dr. Anderson, you have experience in pediatrics. Do you feel like the conversation needs to change, or we need to come up with ways for doctors and patients or nurses and patients or whatever it might be so that we make space for more things like this, more just no stupid questions, bring all your concerns, we'll take them on?
Absolutely. Right. That is really what medicine's supposed to look like. I would tell people in general, if you don't have that type of relationship with your doctor, it's really, really going to be difficult for you to really optimize your health and wellness. You need to be able to ask questions, and you need to be able to get those questions answered. The unfortunate thing now is if that doesn't happen, what do? You go to social media and you try to find answers from other places. You talk to your neighbor who might be a wonderful person in what they do, but they're not necessarily a doctor. One thing I do wonder is whether or not this is where things like telemedicine are going to play a role. You can imagine telemedicine group visits to deal with just these educational components. I think there's things that we've learned in terms of the delivery of healthcare over this last year, which are going to be here to stay. And I think that it does provide the opportunity for us to really, by utilizing these new tools, to do a much better job in building that really sense of communication that needs to happen to really drive good health outcomes.
I want to ask an audience question that came in, and it has to do with if you've received a first dose of a vaccine and had an adverse reaction. So this person says, I received the Moderna vaccine and 10 days later developed an itchy ring around the injection site. Should I still go for the second shot?
So this is a good question. So number one, my thing is talk to your doctor. Like without examining you and having a relationship with you, it's really hard for me to make any like recommendations. But it all depends on the reaction and what it is. Like there, for instance, the Moderna, it came out in New England Journal of Medicine where people were describing all these different reactions from just the Moderna. Like they're actually seeing more with the Moderna vaccine. And the recommendation is that, that should not prevent you from getting your second shot. So if it is what that person is describing, that it usually goes away on its own and patients are fine. It doesn't prevent them from getting the other shot. So first of all, so my message is, I am glad that you got your first shot. I would encourage you to communicate with your doctor so that you're evaluated to decide, is this a severe reaction or not a severe reaction. But certain types of reactions at the vaccine that may not necessarily mean that you may not be able to get a second vaccine. Like the ones that we really worry about, if someone has like a life-threatening reaction, like those are the ones where we usually, and by that I mean, if you have anaphylaxis, like shortness of breath and other things that are life-threatening, these are the ones where we're more cautious. But for a lot of the other reactions that happen, it may not necessarily mean that you can't complete the series. So.
The time has escaped us, but I do want to ask this last question because as we come to the end here, this is just one event and hopefully people out there can reach their doctors for questions. But if they can't, Dr. Anderson, you mentioned people go online, they go to their neighbor who might not know, the right things to say about this. Where should people go for more information after this? If they still have questions, if they still need to convince a loved one to get vaccinated, what do you suggest?
Sure. Well, I'll say, first of all, I have to put a plug in for all the great work our team's done in pulling together information at Dimock.org. So that's one site for sure. But the other part about it is CDC has been an amazing source of information on this, not only for lay people, but even for us in the medical community. It really has been a wonderful source of information.
Yeah, I guess we're all plugging in organizations. I actually, BMC has also done a phenomenal job. And, there's, if you go to the main site, there's like a Q&A, pretty much all the questions that we were talking about, like what are the frequently asked questions that people have. There's even videos from Nancy Gayden, who's one of the nurses, who actually goes through and describes like the vaccine, like what is an mRNA vaccine? What does it do? She actually draws it out. And actually, these videos were so good, and that information, I actually literally shared it with my family, and I was like, share it widely if you have questions. And CDC also has phenomenal like information that are specifically for patients and do not use like technical language. Yeah, so those are kind of the main places that I would recommend. And also, I would be remiss if I don't mention the state health department. The Massachusetts Department of Public Health has actually had a really good site also that goes through like the vaccines. And also another important thing is like keeping you up to date with like what's going on in terms of vaccinations in the state, like how many people have been vaccinated. It kind of helps boost morale. Like I checked it actually yesterday, and 27% of people over the age of 75 have gotten vaccinated, 20% who are over 65. So we're slowly getting there, but we're getting there.
And I mean, you're all listening to a WBUR Town Hall, so you probably think this already, but you can always listen to our news coverage of the coronavirus pandemic. Our health team is hard at work every single day covering this and bringing experts like Dr. Assoumou and Dr. Anderson here and in our stories. Unfortunately, this is the end of the night, but thank you so much, Dr. Charles Anderson, President and CEO of the Dimock Center, and Dr. Sabrina Assoumou from Boston University School of Medicine and infectious disease physician at Boston Medical Center.
And thank you to everyone who joined us, all of you out there, and for all of the events in the series. We hope that you're coming away from this feeling empowered, feeling more educated, more comfortable, more reassured about the importance of vaccination in ending this pandemic. And if you're interested in hearing more about the history of vaccines and the anti-vaxxer movement, you can subscribe to Endless Thread. That's the podcast I co-host. The series that we did was called Infectious. So go back to May of 2019 in your feed to find that in full. And one last thing, WBUR CitySpace is always looking for your feedback on these kinds of events. And we want to just keep making them better and better. So we are going to drop a link to a very quick survey about this event and this series of events. And we would love it if you could share your thoughts with us.
Thanks again, and have a good night, everyone.